Welcome back. This is video 3 of this module, and it covers a whole lot of stuff. So let's get going. I can get this PowerPoint opened up. I can do it right here. And away we go. All right, we're at element K. It is called hot work permit. And up there. The employer shall issue a hot work permit for hot work operations conducted on or near a covered process. And that phrase again, on or near a covered process. The permit shall document that the fire prevention and protection requirements in 29 CFR 1910.252A have been implemented prior to beginning the hot work operations. It shall indicate the dates authorized for hot work and identify the object on which hot work is to be performed. The permit shall be kept on file to completion of the hot work operations. So prior to beginning, dates, authorize, and identify the object. And you got to keep it until the completion of the hot work operations. That's the whole standard 1910.119, except that it incorporates 1910, I got 20 up there, 252A, which adds a lot. So here it is. Fire prevention and protection, basic precautions. For elaboration of these basic precautions and of the special precautions of paragraph D2 of this section, as well as the delineation of the fire protection and prevention responsibilities of welders and cutters, their supervisors, including outside contractors, and those in management on whose property cutting and welding is to be performed, see standard for fire prevention and in use of cutting and welding process and an FPA standard, which is incorporated by references. The basic precautions for fire prevention, welding, and cutting work are fire hazards. The object to be welded or cut cannot readily be moved. All movable fire hazards in the vicinity shall be taken to a safe place. Guards. If the object to be welded or cut cannot be moved, and if all the fire hazards cannot be removed, then guards shall be used to confine the heat, sparks, and slag, and to protect the immovable fire hazards. We've had to use that before. Move hazards if they can't move, guard them. Restrictions. If the requirements stated in paragraph A1I and A1II, ones we just talked about, if this section cannot be followed, then welding and cutting shall not be performed. That's pretty simple. Can't move it or guard it, can't work around it. When the nature of the work performed, oops, gotta get rid of that up here, falls within the scope of paragraph A1II of this section, certain additional precautions may be necessary. Combustible material. Whenever there are floor openings or cracks in the flooring that cannot be closed, precautions shall be taken so that no readily combustible materials on the floor below will be exposed to sparks, which might drop through the floor. The same precaution shall be observed with regard to cracks in holes or walls, open doorways, and open or broken windows. They want to make sure no sparks get through, because that could really be bad, because they're going to get through the place we probably can't see. In other words, this covers guarding hazards that can't be moved. Floor openings of walls, doorways, and broken windows must be guarded. Fire extinguishers. Suitable fire extinguishing equipment shall be maintained in a state of readiness for instant use. Such equipment may consist of pails of water, buckets of sand, hose, or portable extinguishers, depending upon the nature and quantity of the combustible material exposed. Have suitable fire extinguisher equipment ready, depending on nature and quantity of combustible. That's the meat and potatoes of that one. Fire watch. This is really important. Fire watch shall be required whenever welding or cutting is performed in locations where other than a minor fire might develop, or any of the following conditions exist. Other than a minor fire might develop. I don't like that wording, but there it is. Or these conditions exist. Appreciable combustible material in building construction or contents closer than 35 feet to the point of operation. 35 feet is a long ways. It's almost the width of that classroom, the long ways. Appreciable combustibles are more than 35 feet away, but are easily ignited by sparks if there's any of them there. Wall or floor openings within a 35-foot radius expose combustible materials in adjacent areas, including concealed spaces in walls or floors. So move combustibles 35 feet away, more if they're easily ignited by sparks. How long is 35 feet? Like I said, it's about the entire width of that classroom. Protect walls or floor openings. Combustible materials are adjacent to the opposite side of metal partitions, walls, ceilings, or roofs, and are likely to be ignited by conduction or radiation. Now, it'd have to get pretty hot to go through a wall, but it could happen. So combustibles on the other side of metal partitions that are likely to be ignited by conduction or radiation must be protected. Fire watchers shall have fire extinguisher equipment readily available and be trained in its use. They shall be familiar with facilities for sounding an alarm in the event of a fire. They shall watch for fires in all exposed areas, try to extinguish them only when obviously within the capacity of the equipment available, or otherwise sound the alarm. A fire watch shall be maintained for at least a half hour after completion of welding or cutting operations to detect and extinguish possible smoldering fires. We had occasion when they did some stuff at OK Foods on a Friday night and want to get it out of there. They put everything away, went home, and about half an hour later there was a fire. They didn't have a fire watch, and we had a fire. It wasn't too bad, fortunately, but there was a fire after they left. Fire watchers have fire extinguisher equipment available, trained in use, familiar with facilities for sounding a fire alarm, watch for fire in all exposed areas, try to extinguish it if within the capacity of the equipment, and maintain for at least half an hour after completion of the operations. Authorization before cutting or welding is permitted, the area shall be inspected by the individual responsible for authorizing cutting or welding operations. He shall designate precautions to be followed in granting authorization to proceed, preferably in the form of a written permit. This says preferably because this is 252, but in process safety management, it requires a written permit. So there you go. Before operations, the person going to sign that thing. This is a good thing OSHA does when they do permits. They make the person that sign it be responsible for it. If you're going to put your name on something, you're probably going to take precautions. They can designate precautions. They can go far beyond this if they want to, prior to granting authorization in the form of a written permit. Again, PSM requires a written permit. Floors where combustible materials such as paper clippings, wood, shavings, or textile fibers are on the floor shall be swept clean for a radius of 35 feet. That's a big area. Combustible floors shall be kept wet, like a wood floor or something like that, covered with damp sand or protected by fire-resistant shields. Where floors have been wet down, personnel operating arc welding or cutting equipment shall be protected from possible shock. So there you go. When combustible on a floor, swept clean within 35 feet. Combustible floors wet down, arc weld is protected from shock. Prohibited areas. Cutting or welding should not be permitted in the following situations. An area is not authorized by management. In sprinkler buildings, while such protection is impaired. In other words, you have a sprinkler building and that sprinkler protection is impaired. You can't do any cutting or welding. In the presence of explosive atmospheres, mixtures of flammable gases, vapors, liquids, dust, or air, or explosive atmospheres that may develop inside uncleaned or improperly prepared tanks or equipment, which have previously contained such materials, or that may develop in areas with the accumulation of combustible dusts. That's kind of like a no-brainer, but there it is. In areas near the storage of large quantities of exposed, readily ignitable materials such as bulk sulfur, baled paper, or cotton. Cotton bales are wicked, though. They can be burning inside all night long. Prohibited in the presence of explosive atmospheres or near large storage of large quantities of exposed, readily ignitable materials. Relocation of combustibles. Where practicable, all combustibles shall be relocated at least 35 feet from the work site. Where relocation is impracticable, combustibles shall be protected with flame-proof covers or otherwise shielded with metal or asbestos guards or curtains. Remove combustibles 35 feet away. If not possible, protect with covers or curtains, okay? Ducts and conveyor systems that might carry sparks to distant combustibles shall be suitably protected or shut down. Combustible walls, where cutting or welding is done near walls, partitions, ceiling, or roof combustible construction, fire-resistant shields or guards shall be provided to prevent ignition. Non-combustible walls, if welding to be done on a metal wall, partition, ceiling, or roof, precautions shall be taken to prevent ignition of combustibles on the other side due to conduction or radiation, preferably by relocating combustibles. Where combustibles are not relocated, a fire watch on the opposite side from the work shall be provided. There you go. There's the combustible cover. Welding shall not be attempted on a metal partition, wall, ceiling, or roof having combustible covering, nor on walls or partitions of combustible sandwich type panel construction. Now let's talk welding on that, not near it, on it. Pipes. Cutting or welding on pipes or other metal in contact with combustible walls, partitions, ceilings, or roofs should not be undertaken if the work is close enough to cause ignition by conduction. No welding on walls, combustible covers, no welding with pipes in contact with combustible walls if it's close enough to cause ignition. Judgment call there. Management shall recognize its responsibility for the safe use of cutting and welding equipment on its property and, based on fire potentials of plant facilities, establish areas for cutting and welding and establish procedure for cutting and welding in other areas. Designated individual responsible for authorizing cutting and welding operations in areas not specifically designed for such process. At all the OK facilities, the maintenance shop was an area designated for cutting and welding, so they couldn't have pallets in there or anything like that, any combustibles in there. Insist that cutters or welders and their supervisors are suitably trained in the safe operation of their equipment and the safe use of the process. Advise all contractors about flammable materials or hazardous conditions of which they may not be aware. Again, management responsible that those involved are trained in safe operation of equipment and safe use of the process, and let the contractors know. The supervisor shall be responsible for the safe handling of the cutting or welding equipment and the safe use of the cutting or welding process. And the supervisor shall determine the combustible materials and hazardous areas present or likely to be present in the work location. The supervisor again shall protect combustibles from ignition by the following: have the work moved to a location free from dangerous combustibles. If the work cannot be moved, have the combustibles moved to a safe distance from the work, or have combustibles properly shielded against ignition. This is kind of repetition here. See that cutting and welding are so scheduled that plant operations that might expose cutting combustibles to ignition are not started during the hours of cutting and welding. That's not a bad idea. Shall secure authorization for cutting or welding operations from the designated management representative. Shall determine that the cutter or welder secures his approval that conditions are safe before going ahead. The cutter or welder has to secure the supervisor's approval. Shall determine that fire protection and extinguishing equipment are properly located at the site. Where fire watchers are required, he shall see that they are available at the site. Supervisor has a lot of responsibility here. Fire prevention precautions. Cutting or welding shall be permitted only in areas that are or have been made fire safe. When work cannot be moved practically, as in most construction work, the area shall be made safe by removing combustibles or protecting combustibles from ignition sources. Welding or cutting containers. Used containers. No welding, cutting, or other hot work shall be performed on used drums, barrels, tanks, or other containers until they have been cleaned so thoroughly as to make absolutely certain there are no flammables present or any substances such as grease, tars, acids, or other materials which, when subject to heat, might produce flammable or toxic vapors. Any pipelines or connections to the drum or vessel shall be disconnected or blanked. You've heard horror stories, I'm sure, of somebody trying to weld on a barrel that had something in it that was flammable and blows up and kills them. Venting and purging. All hollow spaces, cavities, or containers shall be vented to permit the escape of hot gases. Oops, back it up. I'm trying to move my little thing here so I can see that. Before preheating, cutting, or welding, purging with inert gas is recommended. Inert means a gas that's not flammable. That's kind of inert means it's kind of like a dead gas. Confined spaces, accidental contact. When arc welding means suspended for any substantial period of time, such as during lunch or overnight, all electrodes shall be removed from the holders and the holders carefully located so that accidental contact cannot occur and the machine be disconnected from the power source. Torch valve. In order to eliminate the possibility of gas escaping through leaks or improperly closed valves, when gas welding or cutting, the torch valve shall be closed and the gas supply to the torch positively shut off at some point outside the confined area whenever the torch is not to be used for a substantial period of time, such as during lunch hour or overnight. Where practicable, the torch and hose shall be removed from the confined space. See what they're getting at here in a confined space. A slight leak in overnight could cause a flammable or explosive atmosphere. That's all of 1910.252A, the portion that's required by element K. There's a lot more than 1910.252. So if there's welding involved, it should be followed also. Now we're going to get to management of change. This is the next element, element L. Management of change. The employer shall establish and implement written procedures to manage changes, except for replacement in kind, to process chemicals, technology, equipment, procedures, and changes to facilities that affect a covered process. Again, from replacement in kind means a replacement which satisfies the design specifications exactly. The procedure shall assure that the following considerations are, I gotta move myself again here. All right. I guess I messed this up, didn't I? Gotta get started again. All right, we know what replacement in kind is. There we go. That's what I'm trying to do. There you go. Procedure shall assure the following considerations are addressed prior to any change: the technical basis for the proposed change, the impact of change on safety and health, modifications to operating procedures, necessary time period for the change, and authorization requirements for a proposed change. Employees involved in operating a process and maintenance and contract employees whose job task will be affected by a change in the process shall be informed of and trained in the change prior to startup of the process or affected part of the process. In other words, people have to be trained when there's a change before it starts up. If a change covered by this paragraph results in a change in the process safety information required by paragraph D of the section, such information shall be updated accordingly. Again, what else did this happen? In the PSSR, the pre-startup safety review, they said the same thing. If anything in paragraph D, which is process safety information, is changed, not only do you have to do management change, you have to do a pre-startup safety review. If a change covered by this paragraph results in a change in the operating procedures or practices required by paragraph F of the section, such procedures or practices shall be updated accordingly. Again, paragraph F is operating procedures. And that's all there is to that standard. You can see these standards, each section of the standard isn't very big, but it packs a wallop when you have to go and write your own policy to adhere to it. Incident investigation. The employer shall investigate each incident which resulted in or could reasonably have resulted in a catastrophic release of highly hazardous chemicals in the workplace. Again, a release or could reasonably have resulted in a catastrophic release. I don't like that wording, but that's what it is. An incident investigation shall be initiated as promptly as possible, but not later than 48 hours following the incident. Have your incident investigations handling, get it out, put the date and time on it, you started, and you've got that covered. An incident investigation team shall be established and consist of at least one person knowledgeable in the process involved, including a contract employee if the incident involves work of the contractor, and other persons with appropriate knowledge and experience to thoroughly investigate and analyze the incident. In other words, you want to get the right people for this. It's important. A report shall be prepared at the conclusion of the investigation, which includes at a minimum the date of the incident, the date the investigation began, a description of the incident, the factors that contributed to the incident, and any recommendations resulting from the investigation. The employer shall establish a system to promptly address and resolve the incident report findings and recommendations. Resolutions and corrective actions shall be documented. This is usually in the form of like a hit list or punch list type of thing. The report shall be reviewed with all affected personnel whose job tasks are relevant to the incident findings, including contract employees where applicable. Incident investigation report shall be retained for 5 years, and then after 5, get rid of them. Now, this in the emergency planning and response is a huge document, and we're going to cover the important parts that they have. Emergency planning and response. The employer shall establish and implement an emergency action plan for the entire plant in accordance with the provisions of 29 CFR 1910.38. We're going to go over that. In addition, the emergency action plan shall include procedures for handling small releases. Employers covered under this standard may also be subject to the hazardous waste and emergency operations provision contained in 29 CFR 1910.120, which is in here, but we're not going to cover that because it's a lot. And it's nothing I'm going to refer to in any of the tests. That's the whole PSM standard for emergency planning and response. Now let's look at 1910.38, emergency action plans. Now this 1910.38 doesn't applies to process safety management, but it applies to everything just about. An employer must have an emergency action plan whenever an OSHA standard in this part requires one. The requirements in this section apply to each such emergency action plan. So any OSHA standard requires emergency action plan. It's a good idea to have one. Written and oral emergency action plans. An emergency action plan must be in writing, kept in the workplace, and available to employees for review. However, an employer with 10 or fewer employees may communicate the plan orally to employees. So you don't have to be written if it's 10 or fewer employees. Why? I don't know. So anyhow, PSM requires one. So this section applies if PSM applies. Minimum elements of the emergency action plan and the minimum procedures for reporting a fire or other emergency. Procedures for emergency evacuation, including type of evacuation and exit route assignments. Every facility should have a map with exits clear. Procedures to be followed by employees who remain to operate critical plant operations before they evacuate. There may be things that need to be shut down, closed off before evacuation. Procedures to account for all employees after evacuation. This is important because if you don't, fire department shows up and they say, "Where's so-and-so?" And they say, "I don't know." And he's that so-and-so down at the cafe, the cafe down, she have a cup of coffee. They're going to go into that burning building, try to find him. Procedures to be followed by employees performing rescue or medical duties, and the name or job title of every employee who may be contacted by employees who need more information about the plan or explanation of their duties under the plan. Employee alarm system. An employer must have and maintain an employee alarm system. The employee alarm system must use a distinctive signal for each purpose and comply with the requirements of 1910.165, which we're not going to cover in this. Here they go, reference another OSHA standard. It contains some information, obviously, regarding employee alarm systems. An employer must designate and train employees to assist in a safe and orderly evacuation of other employees. Remember, all employees aren't the same, so some employees might have a little more difficulty getting out. This is usually a part of the responsibility of supervisors and leads to do this. Review of emergency action plan. The employer must review the emergency action plan with each employee covered by the plan. When the plan is developed or the employee is assigned initially to the job, when the employee's responsibility under the plan changed, and when the plan is changed. So those 3 times when it's got to be reviewed. Now we're going to briefly go over 1910.120 hazardous waste operations and emergency response, because this is huge. It covers the following operations unless the employer can demonstrate the operation does not involve employee exposure or the reasonable possibility for employee exposure to safety or health hazards. And you're probably going to cover this in your hazardous materials class. And this is about a body, but here, corrective actions. I'm not going to get into RECR and all that stuff. Treatment storage facilities. Cleanup operations. And they talk about treatment. I'm gonna not say this is not going to be on a test. This is too detailed, and there's been a lot of time on this. I don't think it's going to get any bang for our buck. So I'm going to go through it pretty quickly here. There's some buddy systems, and while I'm doing this, I'm going to tell you what happened at Heaven when I first got to OK Foods. A week later, we got a notice from EPA saying they were going to audit our Heavener process safety management. And we didn't have any process safety management. So we scrambled. The Heavener plant knew of a guy that's a consultant. They called him. He came down. We sat for 2 weeks in the conference room for 10 hours a day, going over, coming up with something that we can get for this inspection by EPA. Every time we got to this thing, into this part of it, we went through the process safety things like we're doing here now, A to N. Every time we got to N here, and we didn't know what to do, to be honest with you. And we hemmed and hawed, and we didn't come up with something, and we really weren't happy with it. It was just too involved. We didn't have time to get it done. So when it came time for the inspector to show up, he's going through this too, and he gets to this section, and we're going like that kind of, and he says, "Are you guys first responders?" And we said, "What do you mean? Like, the fire department or the paramedics?" "No." "Okay," and he skipped it, basically. And the consultant who's supposed to know all this stuff, and we're paying this guy a lot of money. We wanted him to come back and write this plan, and guess what? He wouldn't do it. He didn't want to get involved in it. So that's why this is so I'm going to go through it because it's just so involved that you can see there's training, emergency response plan. Doesn't have to duplicate the other plan, but they quote 1910-38. So has certain elements: pre-emergency planning, personnel roles, emergency recognition and prevention, safe distances and place of refuge, site security control, all stuff you probably should have, evacuation routes and procedures, decontamination procedures, emergency medical treatment and first aid. You should know what you have, and you should know the emergency medical treatment for ammonia, if that's what it is. So training, there's training again. Training for emergency response employees shall be completed before they are called upon to perform in real emergencies. That's a good idea. And there's some exceptions, which, and again, I'm not going to go into this too deep because it is so involved, and it is probably going to be covered in your hazardous operation. This is Q. This is of that. There you go. If employees decide to just evacuate and not respond, they're exempt from this paragraph if they have a plan for 1910-38. Arkansas Refrigeration Systems, one of our guys went to work for them, and guess what? They decided they weren't going to do anything but evacuate. This is the first decision an organization must make: respond or not. Reasons to not respond: less expense, you don't have to purchase response gear, train, etc. Your people won't put in harm's way. Reasons to have a response team: there could be civilian casualties. If your facility is in a populated area, you will not be able to stop or slow the release. Frequently, employees will try to help anyhow, even if they aren't trained, especially if it's a friend or coworker in trouble, and there'll be considerable downtime while the system drains and it's safe to re-enter. So that's, and then there's more elements of emergency plan. I said it's way too detailed to get into for this purposes of this class. You need to know it's here. You need to know it's extensive, and you'll probably cover it in your hazardous operations class. There's your first responder awareness level. And then you have your first responder operations level, first hazardous materials technician, third level, and hazardous materials specialist is your fourth level. You should kind of have an idea of what they are when you find them. And incident commanders, trainers, there's a lot of stuff: medical surveillance, chemical protective clothing. There's the three sections cited in here are 1910-38. Emergency response plans, 1910-134, PPE, and 1910-1200, hazard communication. Trade secrets. This is I believe, the very last one of these part of the process safety management standard. Now, we missed a couple. We're going to go back and catch them in the next thing because they were just too big to fit in here. Trade secrets. Basically, what they're saying in here, and the purpose of this plan is, nothing in this paragraph shall preclude the employer from requiring the persons to whom information is made available under this paragraph of this section to enter into a confidentiality agreement to not disclose the information set forth. It says you can't not tell your employees about the hazards and hide under the protection of trade secrets. You can't do that. That's really what they're saying in here. It goes a little more involved than that, but that's the basics of this. This probably doesn't come into play very often. If you run across it, you probably want to get with management, see how trade secrets can be protected and still comply with this standard. That's it. All right, if I can figure out how to do this, I will get out of here.